In the autumn of 1887, in a river valley town in eastern Tennessee called Holt's Crossing, a woman named Della Crane paid $6 for a house she had never been permitted to enter. She was 27 years old. She had arrived in Holt's Crossing 3 weeks earlier with a carpet bag, a worn leather tool roll, and the $72 her uncle had pressed into her hand the morning of his funeral. He had no children, and she was the nearest thing to one. He had taught her what he knew, which was locks. How they were built, how they thought, how the pins inside a cylinder could be convinced to yield if you understood what the maker had intended and what time had done to the mechanism since. He had run the only locksmith shop in Clarksburg for 30 years, and Della had worked beside him since she was old enough to hold a pick without dropping it. When he died, the shop went to creditors. The tools went into her bag. The money bought her passage south to where a cousin had promised her work and then written to say there was none. Holt's Crossing was a town of perhaps 400 people, arranged along a wide bend of the Clinch River, with a mill, a courthouse, a general store, 2 churches, and a row of false-front commercial buildings along the main road that gave the impression of a place slightly larger than it was. The ridge above the valley was still in its autumn color when Della arrived, rust and amber and a few cold yellows, and the river was low and clear in the way rivers are in October, before the November rains come to lift them. She had spent her first 2 weeks in a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Ingle, who fed her well and asked few questions and charged her $1.50 a week for a room on the second floor, with a window that overlooked the mill pond. She had been looking for some form of work that matched what she knew how to do. There was a hardware merchant who seemed interested at first, and then thought better of it. There was a man who ran the mine supply depot outside of town, who told her he had no use for a locksmith, and what he could use was a cook. She was not, she told him, a cook. She spent the 3rd week walking the roads between the town and the surrounding farms, making herself known. And on the Thursday of that week, she happened to pass the courthouse steps where Purvis was reading out the terms of the day's probate auction. The house on Cane Mill Road was listed among the items. Nobody else bid on it. The man running the auction, a county clerk named Purvis, looked over his spectacles at Della as she raised her hand and said, quietly, that the property carried a known encumbrance. She asked what kind. He said the previous occupant, a man named Aldous Greer, had died without heirs and without having settled a matter related to the property's north room. The room had been sealed. The town had a general understanding that it was to stay that way. He could not say more than that. There was some quiet comment among the small crowd of men standing on the courthouse steps. One of them said the house was not worth the deed paper it would be recorded on. Another said a woman buying a house by herself was unusual enough, without the matter of the north room being added to it. Purvis told them to be quiet and addressed himself to Della. He said she was welcome to bid or not to bid as she chose. Della said she understood. She raised her hand again and the gavel came down. If you have ever stood at the edge of a thing others were afraid to look at directly, you know the feeling that settled over her as Purvis handed her the deed. It was not recklessness. It was recognition. The house was a 2-story frame structure at the end of a short lane, set back from the road by a stand of persimmon trees that had gone untended for long enough to grow wild and overlapping. The paint on the siding was the color of old creek water, a gray-green that was neither one thing nor the other. 3 windows on the upper story, 2 on the lower, flanking the front door. The porch had been built carefully, mortised and pegged in the old way, and it still held level despite the years of neglect. The north room was on the upper story, its window boarded from the inside. Della set her carpet bag inside the front door and stood in the downstairs hall for a long moment. The house smelled of dry rot and old ash, and something beneath those, something she could not name at first. Then she placed it. Iron. The smell of iron left undisturbed for a very long time. The neighbor across the lane came to the fence line while Della was clearing dead branches from the porch steps. Her name was Mrs. Cates, and she was a narrow woman in her late 60s with eyes that missed very little. Mrs. Cates said that the town had a standing agreement about the north room, though she could not say it was ever written down anywhere official. Della asked who had made the agreement. Mrs. Cates was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Aldous Greer had made the agreement about 15 years back, and the town had been willing to let him make it because Aldous Greer was not the kind of man you pressed. Della thanked her and went back to the porch. She spent the rest of the afternoon making the house habitable. There was a pump in the kitchen that still worked. There was a wood stove in reasonable condition. The upstairs rooms were dry, which mattered more than most other things. She did not go to the north room that first afternoon. She ate bread and cheese from her bag and read by lamplight until the house was dark and quiet around her. It was past 9 o'clock when she took the lamp and went upstairs. The north room had a standard mortise lock set into the door about 3 inches above center. The keyhole was the old style, broad and rectangular, the kind that took a skeleton key with a long shank and 2 or 3 bits. She crouched and held the lamp close. The keyhole had been stuffed with what appeared to be wax, pressed in from the inside. The door itself had been sealed at the seam with strips of cloth soaked in something that had hardened over time into a dark brown adhesive she recognized as a pine pitch mixture. Someone had wanted very much to keep the air inside the room from the air in the hall. She went back to her bag and took out the tool roll. She unfolded it on the floor of the hallway and worked through the picks by feel. Her uncle had made most of them himself, shaping the steel over a small anvil in the back of the shop in Clarksburg and tempering them in oil until they had exactly the flex he wanted, which was not rigid and not soft, but somewhere precise between the two. Enough give to feel the pins without bending under the torque. She had watched him make each one. She had watched him use each one. She had then used each one herself until the tool and her hand knew each other well enough that she could feel the difference between a pin that would set and a pin that was corroded past setting without having to think about the difference consciously. That was the inheritance, not the steel, the knowing. She selected a long hook and a tension wrench, both of her uncle's making, the metal worn to a pewter smoothness where his fingers had gripped them year after year. A thought came to her as she crouched there in the lamplight. Her uncle had said once that a lock sealed from the inside was the most honest lock there was. It was not keeping something out. It was keeping something in. The difference was small in mechanism and enormous in meaning. The wax in the keyhole was old enough to have gone brittle. She worked a thin nail from her kit into it and broke it in pieces, clearing the keyhole with careful patience. The pieces fell into her palm, waxy and pale, smelling faintly of beeswax and the passage of many years. Then she inserted the tension wrench and felt for the cylinder's resistance. The lock was a 5-pin tumbler, well made, the kind of thing a careful man had installed deliberately. 2 of the pins had corroded into something close to a single mass, fused by the years of sealed air and the slow chemistry of iron oxide. The others moved reluctantly, the springs behind them gone stiff, but not dead. She worked for the better part of an hour. The lamp needed trimming twice. She shifted position twice when her knees went numb against the floor planks, resettling herself without releasing the tension wrench, keeping the faint rotational pressure constant in the cylinder while she moved. At one point, she heard the wind in the persimmon trees outside and nothing else. The house around her was entirely still in the way old houses are when all the people who lived in them are gone, and the walls have forgotten the sound of voices. The third pin set with a faint click she felt rather than heard. The fourth followed after another few minutes. The two corroded pins required a different approach. She reduced her tension to barely perceptible, the wrench almost passive in the keyway, and worked at the mass from its edge, trying to find whatever movement remained. There was some. Not much. Enough. Then the cylinder turned. The door did not open on its own. She had to break the pitch seal with the flat of a chisel, working along the seam from bottom to top. And even then the door resisted, swollen in its frame. She put her shoulder against it and pushed steadily and felt the wood yield by degrees until it swung inward with a low sound, and the air from inside the north room came out past her into the hallway. It was cold. Not the cold of a room in an autumn night, but a deeper cold, the cold of air that had not moved in years. It carried the iron smell, much stronger now, and below that, something else. Something she identified after a moment as paper. A great quantity of paper left in sealed darkness for a long time. Della stood in the doorway with the lamp held out before her. The north room was not empty. Along the far wall, stacked from floor to near ceiling, were wooden crates. She counted 7 before she stopped counting and simply looked. They were stamped on their faces in black ink. The ink faded but legible. 3 words, Greer Timber Company. Along the right wall stood a standing desk, the kind a man uses when he does not want to sit, with a series of narrow drawers beneath the writing surface and a raised shelf above it. On the shelf, arranged with a precision that struck her immediately as deliberate, stood a row of ledger books. She counted 14 of them. On the desk's writing surface, laid flat as though set down in the middle of work and never returned to, was a single sheet of paper with writing on it. She crossed the room and read it. It was a letter, unfinished, addressed to a man named Calvin Pruitt of the Holtz Crossing Recorder. It was dated October the 14th, 1872. The hand was precise and without flourish. The letter said, "I have set down in the attached account what Greer has done to the Whitmore family and to others whose names I have placed in the record. I am sealing this room tonight because I have been told, not plainly but clearly enough, that my continuing to hold these records constitutes a danger to me. I ask that if I am found unable to deliver this account myself, someone with the wit to understand what these ledgers contain will do what I haven't been able to." The letter was signed, H. Birch. Della set the lamp on the desk and stood in the cold, iron-smelling air of the room for a long time. She had bought the house for $6. She had come to Holtz Crossing with nothing but a tool roll and some dead man's money. What she had found in the north room was not treasure, not in the way the word was commonly meant. It was something more durable than treasure. It was evidence. She did not touch the ledgers that night. She lit a second lamp from the first and went through the room carefully, touching nothing, looking at everything. The crates along the far wall were sealed with iron nails, and she noted but did not open them. The desk drawers were unlocked. 3 of them held sheaves of documents, contracts, receipts, property surveys. She recognized the forms by type, having seen similar papers cross her uncle's counter over the years in Clarksburg. Deeds recorded, survey plats, notes of transfer. What she saw, even in that first hour, was a systematic record of land transactions carried out over at least a decade, many of them centering on a single family name, Whitmore. She went to bed with the north room door standing open. The county courthouse opened at 8 o'clock. Della was on its steps at 7:30, waiting. The deed recorder, a man named Haskell who wore the same brown coat every day and kept his office with the tidiness of someone who thought of the papers in his care as living things, looked at her across his counter when she explained what she had found and was quiet for a moment before he said anything. His first response wasn't disbelief. It was the particular stillness of a man whose suspicion of something has just been given a shape and a name. He had been recorder for 9 years, he told her. He had been recording in that time without having any reason to question the surveys already on file, which predated his tenure. He could not be faulted for that. He did not ask her to say he could not be faulted. He simply stated it, the way a careful man states the thing he needs to have understood before he proceeds. He said that the Whitmore family had once held a timber claim on 400 acres of ridgeland above the river, that the claim had been contested and eventually transferred to the Greer Timber Company in 1871, and that 2 members of the Whitmore family still lived in the county. Della asked their names. He said, an old man named Franklin Whitmore, who lived above the river on a rented parcel, and his granddaughter, a young woman named Nora who taught school in the village of Reeder's Mill, about 7 miles east. Della said she would need to see the original transfer documents for the Ridge land claim. Haskell looked at her for another moment. Then he went to his files. The transfer documents took him 20 minutes to locate. They were in a folder behind a tab marked Greer Timber Company, Acquisitions, 1869 to 1875, which was itself one of 4 folders of similar label in a wooden box on the bottom shelf of the file cabinet behind his desk. He carried the folder to the counter and opened it and laid the documents flat, and Della read them standing up, turning each page with a care that Haskell seemed to notice. When she had read through to the survey description, she stopped and read that passage twice. The described bearing and distance for the northern boundary of the Greer parcel did not match the bearing and distance in the Birch Ledger's right-hand column for the same survey. The difference was 120 links on a Gunter's chain, which translated to approximately 79 feet, which in terms of ridge acreage translated to the question of which side of a specific granite outcropping the boundary line ran on. The white oak stand was on the far side of the outcropping from the Whitmore holding. The survey description as filed put the outcropping inside the Greer parcel. The birch measurement put it outside, 79 feet, 120 links, a family's timber and then their land, and then their choices for the next 16 years. All of it pivoting on a distance a man could walk in under a minute. It took Della 4 days to read the ledgers. She read them at the standing desk in the north room, with both lamps going, wrapped in her shawl against the cold that seemed to persist in the room regardless of the weather outside. She had her uncle's habit of reading documents with a sheet of paper at hand for notes, and she filled 3 sheets before she reached the 3rd ledger. The ledgers were organized by year and then by transaction, each entry written in the same careful hand throughout. The numbers in a right justified column, and the descriptions in plain language that did not avoid naming what was being described. Birch hadn't written the ledgers as accusation. He had written them as record, in the way a good bookkeeper writes a record, which is to say he wrote what happened and what it cost and what the resulting balance was and nothing more. It was not his commentary that made the ledgers devastating. It was the columns themselves. H. Birch, she came to understand, had been Aldous Greer's bookkeeper. He had kept the company's internal records for 11 years. What those records showed, rendered across 14 volumes in a bookkeeper's careful hand, was a pattern of acquisition built on falsified survey descriptions. The Greer Timber Company had presented surveys to the county recorder that described ridge parcel boundaries in language that did not match the physical monuments on the ground. The discrepancies were not large in any single instance. 2 chains here, 3 chains there, enough to shift a boundary line into a neighbor's timber stand without triggering immediate dispute, because the neighbors in question were families without the resources to commission independent surveys of their own. In the 4th ledger, Birch had begun keeping a parallel column. On the left side of each entry, the official survey description as recorded with the county. On the right side, his own measurement, made by walking the ground himself with a borrowed instrument on days when the company crew was elsewhere. He had been doing this, the dates showed, for at least 3 years before he sealed the room. He had been building a case in the only language available to him, which was numbers, and he had been building it carefully, knowing what would happen to him if Greer found out. The 4th ledger had a loose page inserted near the front, in a hand slightly different from the ledger entries, more hurried. It listed 9 family names in a column. The Whitmores were second from the top. Below each name was a parcel size and a dollar figure. The dollar figures were what the parcels would have been worth if the surveys had been run true. The Whitmore claim had been the largest. The falsified survey had moved the Greer boundary line 300 feet east of its true position, taking with it the most valuable stand of white oak on the ridge. The oak was what the Whitmore claim had been worth. Without it, the remaining acreage had been assessed at a figure that made the family's mortgage payment impossible to sustain. They had defaulted. The land had passed through a sheriff's sale to a holding company whose only officer was Aldous Greer. H. Birch had written it all down. He had kept duplicate records, his own set alongside the official set. The official set presumably lived in the Greer Company files, wherever those were now. The duplicate set lived in the north room. Della thought about H. Birch, who had sealed this room and written a letter he had not been able to deliver, and had, apparently, disappeared from Holt's Crossing sometime after October of 1872, without leaving a forwarding address in any public record she could find. She went to the courthouse on the 3rd day and asked Haskell if the name Birch appeared in any of the county records from the early 1870s. He spent an hour looking and found one entry, a property rental agreement dated March 1870, a single room above the dry goods store. There was nothing after that. No forwarding address, no record of departure, no death record. He had simply ceased to appear in the county's documentation, and counties recorded what happened to people through the things they bought and sold and rented and owed. And when a man stopped doing those things, he stopped leaving a mark. She thought about what it cost a man to do what he had done, which was not enough, and what it would have cost him to do more. She went to see Franklin Whitmore on the 5th day. He was 81 years old and lived in a 2-room house above the river bend in a condition of dignity that had nothing to do with comfort. He had a kitchen garden that he still worked himself, and a cast-iron stove, and a shelf of books above the table that he had carried from house to house across 60 years of being moved from one rented parcel to the next. He received her without surprise. Old men who have waited a long time for something sometimes recognize its arrival before they understand what it is. Della told him what she had found. She did not soften it, and she did not elaborate beyond what the records showed. She told him the survey description that had been recorded against his family's claim. She told him the actual measurements as recorded in the Birch duplicate ledgers. She told him the difference. He listened without speaking. When she was finished, he was quiet for a time, and then he said, "My father was told the surveyor's chain had been run true. He believed it. He was not a man who assumed he was being lied to. Della said that was what the record showed." Franklin Whitmore looked past her out the window at the river for a long time. Then he asked about his granddaughter. Della said she had not yet gone to Reeder's Mill, but intended to. He said, "Nora will want to know everything. She has always known something was wrong, even though she was not alive when it happened. Some knowledge passes through families like that. Della agreed that it did. She rode to Reeder's Mill on a borrowed horse on the 6th day. Nora Whitmore was 24 years old and met her in the schoolroom after the children had gone home, sitting at the front desk with her hands folded and her expression giving nothing away until Della had finished. Then Nora said, "I want to see the ledgers." Della brought her back to the house on Cane Mill Road the following afternoon, and Nora sat at the standing desk in the north room for 2 hours and read the Birch ledgers in the same methodical way Della had read them. She did not speak much while she read. Once she set down the volume in her hands and pressed her fingers flat against the desk's surface and breathed through her nose for a moment before picking it up again. Della waited downstairs and let her have the room. When Nora came down, she said, "The question is what this is worth, legally, at this distance of time." Della said she had been thinking about that question and that her tentative answer was that it depended on whether the original false survey was still on record in the county deed books, which it was, and whether a corrected survey based on the Birch measurements could be verified against the original boundary monuments on the ground, which might or might not still exist. Nora said, "I know where 2 of the corner stones are. My grandfather took me up the ridge when I was a child and showed me. He showed all of us. There are things a family holds onto when they have nothing else to hold. Those stones on the ridge were one of them. If you have ever seen what it looks like when something a family carried for 15 years, as grief begins to take on the shape of something useful, you would recognize the quality of stillness that came into Nora Whitmore's face in the downstairs hall of that house. It was not triumph. It was the feeling of a weight finally given a proper surface to rest on. Della went up the ridge with Nora and Franklin on a clear morning in the 3rd week of October. Franklin moved slowly but without assistance, and he led them to the first cornerstone from memory, unerringly, along a deer path that had been worn by his own family's feet over generations of walking up to check on timber they no longer owned. The path was not a made path, nothing cleared or graded, just a compression in the leaf litter and a faint wearing of the soil between roots that the feet of people with a reason to walk it had produced over many years. Franklin's feet knew it without his eyes doing very much of the work. The stone was a quarried granite block, dressed on its top face and incised with a cross mark, and the letters W.M. for Whitmore. It was not moved. It sat in the soil with the solidity of something placed by a man who intended it to last, surrounded by the roots of a tulip poplar that had grown up beside it in the intervening decades and partly encircled it, the roots lifting the stone slightly on its downhill side without having moved it. Della crouched and cleared the leaf matter from its top face with her hand and read the incised letters in the cross mark, and then took out her notebook and wrote down the condition. It was precisely where the Birch ledger said it should be, and precisely 312 feet west of where the Greer survey described the boundary to run. Della measured the distance with a surveyor's chain she had borrowed from Haskell at the courthouse. She had never run a survey line before, but she understood the instrument and the principle, which were matters of basic geometry and the reading of a compass. And she worked carefully and then worked it again before she wrote down the figure. Nora held the rear handle of the chain while Della moved forward, counting the links and calling the count back. Franklin stood beside the corner stone and watched them work with his arms folded and his face carrying an expression she could not easily name. It wasn't satisfaction, not yet. It was the look of a man watching something be confirmed that he has known for a long time, in a way that could not be confirmed. The second cornerstone was 100 yards further along the ridge and equally unmoved. It was smaller than the first, a dressed sandstone block rather than granite, set in a depression that the hill's drainage had probably dug deeper around it over the decades, so that the stone now sat lower than it had originally. Nora had to scrape the soil from around its base to read the marks. The cross and the letters were the same. Della ran the chain from the first stone to the second and wrote down that measurement too. Then she ran the bearing between them with the compass and wrote that down. Then she stood and looked across the ridge toward where the white oak stand began, 150 yards further east, the trees old enough that their lower trunks had the gray, ridged character of timber that has been growing for 60 or 70 years, undisturbed. She wrote up her findings in a document she drafted in longhand that evening at the kitchen table, citing the Birch ledger page numbers and the measured distances against the recorded survey figures. She had Haskell review it the following morning. He read it twice and made 2 corrections to her citation of the relevant statutes, and then signed the bottom of the page as a witness to the measurements. It took the county 3 months after that to move through the administrative machinery that Della's document set in motion. She was not a party to those proceedings in any formal legal sense. She had no standing to be. She had found the evidence and measured the ground and written the record, and then she had put it in the proper hands and stood back. The machinery moved slowly, as such things do. There was a period in November when it seemed to stop moving entirely, when the county attorney's office communicated through Haskell that the age of the original transaction posed a question of statute of limitations that would need to be examined. Della went to the courthouse twice during that period and sat in the anteroom outside the county attorney's office for a combined total of 4 hours before being seen. She presented what she had found and what she had measured in plain language both times, and she left both times without any clear indication of what would happen. She spent that waiting period doing other things. She repaired the porch railing, which had rotted at one of its posts and listed enough to be a hazard. She replaced a window sash on the upper story that had lost its glazing putty and let in the cold. She sourced lumber from the mill and fixed the kitchen steps and discovered in the process that the subflooring in the kitchen was sound, which was more than she had expected when she bought the house. She had the stove chimney swept. These were practical necessities, and she did them without drama, because the house needed doing, and she was in it and had the skill to do what was needed, which was in general how she understood her relationship to work. The correction to the deed record was entered in January of 1888. The ridge land, or the portion that could be recovered given the intervening transactions, passed back to Franklin Whitmore's title in a form that Nora, as his heir, could manage and eventually sell to a timber company on terms of her family's own choosing. It was not everything. 15 years of wrongful loss was not fully repayable in land and a corrected record. The Whitmore family had moved 7 times in those 15 years. Franklin had told her during one of her visits to the house above the river. Each move had been to a smaller parcel or a less favorable rental. He had lost 2 sons to the westward migration, young men who might have stayed if there had been land to stay for. He had buried his wife in 1881 in the churchyard of a town she had never expected to be living in. These were the actual costs, and a corrected deed record restored the land, but it did not restore the dead or the scattered. Della did not pretend it did, and she did not say so, and Franklin did not ask her to. What Oldest Greer had been in the county was finished now in ways that could not be reversed. He had died in 1885, before any of this came to light, which meant there was no confrontation, no public naming in a courtroom, no moment of formal reckoning in front of witnesses. His estate had been settled and scattered. His company's records, the official set, had gone to a storage room at the county seat where they had been collecting dust. No one had thought to compare them against what a dead bookkeeper had left sealed in a north room. The corrected deed record was entered. The Greer name on the ridge was replaced by Whitmore. That was all. It was, in the way of these things, sufficient. Della was in the courtroom for the entry of the corrected deed, not because she was required to be, but because she had been the one to open the room. She stood at the back and watched the clerk's pen move across the page, and felt the thing settle into the public record where it would remain. Mrs. Cates came to the fence line again one evening in late January, after the snow had come, and Della was splitting wood for the stove. She stood at the line for a moment watching Della work. She said, "I always thought there was something wrong with that room." Della set the maul down. She said, "There was a great deal right with it, as it turned out." Mrs. Cates considered this for a long time. Then she nodded once and went back inside. Della had stayed longer in Holt's Crossing than she had intended. She had been in the house on Cane Mill Road for 4 months by February, long enough to have repaired the porch railing and rehung the kitchen door and replaced 2 window sashes on the upper story. The house was in better condition than when she had bought it, which was a satisfaction in itself, separate from everything else. Nora Whitmore came to see her on the 2nd Saturday of February, the morning after the timber contract had been signed. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of tea and looked at Della across the table and said, "I have been thinking about what we owe you." Della said they owed her nothing. Nora said that wasn't how she thought about it. Della said she had paid $6 for the house and had lived in it, and the house had given her the room, and the room had given her the ledgers, and the ledgers had given her something to do that was worth doing. The arithmetic did not come out to a debt. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My grandfather wants you to have the surveying chain." Della started to say something and then stopped. The chain was a 40-link Gunter's chain, the standard instrument for land measurement in the territory for the better part of a century. Franklin Whitmore had carried it from the original family holding when they had been forced to sell, and had kept it through every subsequent move as a form of witness, she supposed, to the original acreage. It was a remarkable thing to give away. She said, "Tell your grandfather I will keep it carefully." That night, Della opened the north room for what she had decided would be the last time before she closed it again, properly this time, with no sealed seam and no wax in the keyhole. She had arranged to donate the birch ledgers to the County Historical Society in Knoxville, where they would be indexed and held and could be consulted by anyone who needed to consult them. The transfer was arranged for the following week. She stood in the room with her lamp and looked at the standing desk and the empty shelf above it where the ledgers had been. The crates along the far wall she had opened, finally, and found them to contain the company's original survey instruments, a transit level, plumb bobs, and chaining stakes. She had turned those over to the county surveyor, who had examined them with interest and confirmed that they matched the type and period of the falsified survey work. The cold that had been the room's persistent quality was not a mysterious cold. It was simply a room that had been sealed against ventilation for 15 years. And now that the seal was broken and the windows unboarded, it was the temperature of any other room in the house in February. She set the lamp on the desk and sat in the chair behind it, which she hadn't done before, and looked out the unboarded window at the dark ridge above the town. The white oak that had been the Whitmore family's greatest asset still stood on that ridge, an old stand, the trees thick in the trunk and past the age of prime cutting. They would be worth something for another 20 years, perhaps, and then they would be old growth and worth more for standing than for felling. And the county would have to think about that when the time came. Her uncle had once said, in the way he had of drawing a line between the practical and the principled that was always shorter than people expected, "A lock is not a door." A lock is a decision made by the person who set it. Your job is to understand the decision. Aldous Greer had set the lock on the north room by the same logic he had applied to everything else, which was to keep something inside, contained, harmless. H. Birch had sealed it himself, working from the other side, for entirely different reasons. The same lock, the same wax in the keyhole, the same sealed air. The decision and the counter-decision held in the same small mechanism for 15 years. She had understood the decision. That was all the job required. She picked up the lamp and went out and pulled the door shut behind her, softly without latching it. The surveying chain hung on a peg in the downstairs hall beside her coat. She had looped it there the morning Nora brought it, coiled and oiled, the brass handles worn to a warm, dull gold by the hands of 3 generations. In the lamplight it held its color against the gray plank wall, the one warm thing in the hall. She left the house on Cane Mill Road at the end of February on a hired wagon heading north to Knoxville, the tool roll in her bag and the surveying chain wrapped in cloth in the bottom of her carpet bag. The house went to Nora's name in the deed transfer. One more thing set right, one more record corrected, the kind of correction that could not be undone by another falsified survey, or another sealed room, or another careful man with a pen and a willingness to call theft by the name of accounting. The persimmon trees along the lane were bare still, the winter not yet finished, and the lane between them looked longer in the gray morning light than it had on the afternoon she arrived. She did not look back at the boarded window that was no longer boarded. If you have ever carried something that belonged to the dead and found a use for it that the dead would have recognized, you know the quality of mourning this was. What her uncle taught her had been meant for locks and cylinders and the minor private securities of ordinary life. She had used it for something larger than he had intended, though not larger than the tools were capable of. The wagon moved north toward the pike. The ridge above Holt's Crossing was still dark against the pale sky. The white oak stands visible as a darker density of branches against the winter air. Visible at this distance as exactly what they were, something old, something that had been worth fighting for. Still standing. If a story like this one stays with you, we would be glad to know it. And if you want another, there are more here, waiting, every one of them about a woman who understood that the things the world throws away are sometimes the most important things in it. This story is a dramatization. The specific characters, property records, and events depicted are fictional. The historical practices of survey fraud and contested land claims on which it draws were real features of the frontier period and are a matter of public record.